My humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran Sivasankaran, Guru Piran Nyo, fellow Jnanis. I'm continuing in today's satsang on Mahan's the second principle on thought. In the last four sessions, we covered what thought is, how thoughts are generated, and how Mahan speaks about how to, understand the thought, how to, pause the thought, how to introspect, contemplate, reflect on each of the thoughts that are passing through, the source of where it comes from, and how it impacts our minds, DNA, our intellect's DNA, and more importantly, how it plays an important role in attuning our senses to become more subtle and more sharper and feedback that information back to the mind and the intellect. So there's a combination of dynamics that happens. Ultimately, we see that the mind becomes very illumined, the intellect becomes very sharp and deep, our memory becomes very strong. We're able to not only understand and store important information, but also unlock the secrets of nature that is embedded in all of us. And so, Swamiji, we covered two of Swamiji's important quote. Today, I'm going to go from the I Got book, a very long quote that Swamiji has given. Again, he gives the narration of what this thought is all about in a more comprehensive way. So this is in the first part of the section on thought, which Swamiji talks about. So here there are 30, lines that are 30, lines of code that Swamiji has, and I will take you through one by one, in a more kind of comprehensive way. One often asks, why is this important to know all these philosophies and, these knowledge? As I said before, philosophy, is important. It gives us important insights into what Swamiji calls the paramam aparamam, the internal and the external cosmos, and the interactions and the relationship between the two. So these philosophies, these inquiries, this wisdom knowledge gives us more deeper insights. But not only that, I think in Swamiji's teachings, not only provides the deeper insights, but he also provides the tool of inquiry and the tool of experience. As I said in one of my messages, that Mahan's philosophy is actually practice. One has to practice this and experience this. And so we covered that. So I'm going to talk about how Mahan brings all this notion of thought in the full context of both the paramam aparamam, that means the inner cosmos and the external cosmos that are seamlessly integrated. We think it's separate, but actually, if we have an illumined mind and a sharp intellect, we see that it's interconnected, interwoven. So here I'm going to take you through this key passages. So in this, Swamiji talks about how in nothing, in the no thing, as we mentioned, as we discussed in the previous satsang, no thing means neither matter nor energy. There was no thing, neither matter nor energy. So it is actually what we call supra matter or supra energy, which is what we call spirit, the spiritual, or dimensionless, formless. And from there emerge that one primordial, you can call it seed, embedded in it all the information or the DNA of our universe. Naturally, you need to ask this question: how can from nothing something emerge? And I think I've covered that in one of my previous satsangs in the earlier part, but I'm happy to take that question later on in the Q&A. So here in nothing, there was one. And he says from that one was an atom, right? So this one universal primordial gave rise to the atom. Atom is matter and energy. And that atom was I. Here he's referring to is this, primordial universal identity. And he says that I diffuse is the thought. What is the thought? Actually, as we define what thought is a measure of experience. Experience of what? Or experience of this material world, experience of the molecules and the atoms and the energy, from the form to the formless form to the formless. And all this experience comes from the eye, and the eye diffuses in the form of that experience, what we call the thought. After all, thought is a measure of experience. So one of the experience of thought is vibrations or pulsations. It comes in the form of sound, and it says that this vibration is the vibration of molecules and atoms, and molecules and atoms are part and parcel of the eye. And basically what he's saying is he's bringing that link of that vibration is none other than that eye, you see. And this is very important. Whenever we say that Kundalini vibration or the inner vibration or inner rhythm or inner resonance, we call it different names, or Bhagavan's Geetam, which is spoken about in the Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavan's Geetam is actually the universal or the Lord's vibration or rhythm, right? So what Swamiji is here defining is that pulsation, that vibration, that, all the things that people chant to get that inner vibration or the cosmic vibration or the divine vibration is none other than this primordial entity or the primordial personality that is embedded in the core of all the DNA of everything, matter, sentient and insentient beings. And he says that, and sound is but thought. So again, he's making the reference that the pulsation, the vibration of I in the form of matter and energy is sound. And sound is nothing but an experience. We experience sound, we experience frequencies. And he says it's nothing but that. If you don't have that measure of experience, then you don't cognize it. So he says sound is actually thought, a measure of experience. So he's making this link between thought, he's making this link between, the I, the universal, primordial, formless, that gives formless form, that experience that gives us form. After all, if you see that heat, cold, matter, energy, all are actually a resonance of atoms and molecules and so on. And we see that why this is really important is that our physical body is made out of atoms and molecules and energy, and we feel those vibrations. And where does the vibrations come from? We have sound, and later on I'll speak about light, and all this emanates from that eye. So whatever we are feeling and the vibrations that we are getting is actually a semblance of that primordial eye that is in the form of the matter and energy. It reverberates as that frequency. But in the formless, it is that primordial, substratum that is universal and silence. So here, we have seen this in many of our previous satsangs of how matter, energy, as you go deeper and deeper, we see that it actually ultimately leads us back to that primordial. And this is where the meditation method is very important to help one slowly, focus back on all the thoughts that are being generated, and then, rechannel back and, encase it within that primordial, and you see that all of them ultimately emerge with that absolute universal personality. That's what meditation is about. So we see that that primordial atom, as Swamiji talks about, we call it quantum. Quantum means a measure of, energy. And energy is nothing but, an experience of this material world. So what we see here is that that atom was the I, which is the primordial entity, and from there, everything is unraveled. So we see that, so Swamiji speaks about this in this quote of how, the thought, which is the measure of experience, is actually a manifestation of that I in this four-dimensional universe. Similarly, when we are able to see things, a frequency, so hearing is a particular frequency, sight is a particular frequency. So when I talk about frequency, I'm talking about vibrations, right? So here, when the eye is able to pick up, various spectrums, here fire he refers to as spectrums, right? So, and the spectrum is essentially nothing but the thought itself, the thought which is emanates as an experience, where experience means you're able to cognize particular frequencies. And it shows that this spark or this fire are from the atoms, because you see that within the atoms you have protons and electrons and all those things, and they emanate as fire. Photons are actually what we call fire or light. So we see that all of this emerges from that primordial I. And he says that the atoms formed is but thought. You see, so again, thought is the atoms are actually a measure of experience. We experience it. You know, if you are a scientist, if you want to study a particular atom or molecule, you'd have to put it through electron microscopy or various gadgets that essentially measures them and gives the person who's observer that experience. And that experience is a measure of thought. So what you see is that all the things that you see, you hear, you cognize, everything is a measure of experience, which is thought itself. And Swamiji says, and this is where the link eventually becomes that the thought and the thinker, and that relationship is made. So on the 11th line, he says that the cohesion of atom is actually the world. The integration of all these different atoms and molecules are the world. And the world is nothing but the thought, because all the building blocks of atoms and electrons and protons and everything is actually thought itself, a measure of experience. And then he goes on to speak about, so this is the universe. Then he speaks about this sentient beings, and how, like how the universe had a primordial seed. Atoms have, the primordial entity in there, you can call it God particle. As you see, the scientists are racing to understand the God particle, or what we call Higgs boson, the primordial particle. And within that, we too inherit that primordial, particle or seed, and it comes in the form of, our own life force. And you see that our life force is packed with so much information that in that small seed, the entire life of a person is unraveled. As Swamiji said in the previous satsang, a small seed, a seed of a banyan tree, the seed has all the information to create a huge, humongous banyan tree. So the same thing, that the small seed, the primordial atom, gave rise to this expansive universe. And the same DNA is imprinted in us. The same thought, that experience is imprinted in all of us. And that gives rise to not only our physical body, but also gives rise to our intellect and our mind, which is way expansive than our material body. So, and a fragment of the universality is embedded in that, the mind that we have. Because the mind, while the body is limited because of matter and energy, has limited frequency, the mind, which is anchored on the body, will also be limited. But the mind that is anchored on that universal personality or the universal identity would have unbounded, dimensions. So here he speaks about, how the life force is also a thought, and that forms our body, and the body is, so the body itself is a thought, right? And it's an experience. And you see that it gives rise to, through the, by chance, we see that people come together, and you see that fertilization takes place, and you see body forming, and and that consciousness, that the generator of the thought is also embedded in that. And we see that, the body then forms, that experience, reacts to the world, reacts to, when the mother is eating the food, breathing, and that is that experience. And through that experience, you see that the fetus grow, and 10 months, the fetus leaves the mother's womb, and then that journey continues until perhaps maybe 70, 80, 90 years old, and then the body starts disintegrating. So he links back this beautifully to then, life exists in body. without the body, the life existence in this material world does not make any sense, right? So he says that, so body is thought, so life exists in body. So our life experiences, and I said experiences, life is but experience, right? And that experience itself is thought. So what we see here is that, and this is the part he makes the link, the quality of our life depends very much on the thoughts that we generate, the thoughts that we experience, and this is why Swamiji always says, Unarva Gavani. Unarva Gavani means, ensure your mind is anchored on that universal identity, so that the mind, through a process called the spiritual osmosis, the mind reverberates, resonates with a universal frequency. It starts generating universal thoughts. It starts generating expansive thoughts, so that our life experiences become more and more universal. So he makes that link between life itself, but our thought, a measure of experience. And then he goes on to say that the body begets knowledge. And where does this physical being get that knowledge from? It gets from that thought that we generate. As I mentioned, the process in Satsang 1 and 2, that the body has sensory organs, and the sensory organs bring information, and that information is channeled to the mind, which then uses an important component, which is called the intellect. And how strong and how deep our intellect and the tools of inquiry, tools of inference, tools of making sense will illumine that mind and store those important memories. So that links are very important. But all of this is about experience, being enlightened experience. That is why Swamiji says, Arivin Arival. He talks about the experiential knowledge, not the theoretical knowledge. So he says, through that knowledge, one attains that realization. See, so it's not just one can chant a mantra, one can read a scripture, but without understanding it and putting it to practice, it doesn't mean anything. One needs to experience that mantra. One needs to be that mantra. One needs to be that message in that scripture, right? And so that knowledge gives you that attainment of that realization. And when you realize that, you see that you are that I, that the primordial atom, the primordial substratum that emanates as vibration and experience that gives us everything that we cognize in this material world. So here, then he goes on to explain about the the atoms that precedes form, the primordial seed. Within us, the DNA is embedded, in us. So you see that a tiger DNA, a tiger will give birth to a tiger. Of course, one can do crossbreeding and all those things. Similarly, a buffalo will give birth to a buffalo, a bear will give birth. So the DNA is such that, the offsprings will be there. But here is what we see, that we inherit, all of us, every being inherits the DNA of the primordial. So what comes out of that mold must be primordial and divine. Now, how is it that we miss it? And that is because our mind is so caught up with this material experience that somebody spoke about in the last satsang, that because we are so focused on the material experience, we have not experienced that inner cosmos, the generator, the thinker, the knower of these thoughts. And this is where that introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation and the deep tapas are very important. He also speaks about ego. In ego, it is I. Ego here is not the pride factor, which most people get confused. Ego is that which brings all this information together and gives us a reality, a measure of experience of the reality. And that ego could be shrunken, or the ego could be an expansive universal personality. So again, we see that it is none other than how well we understand this primordial substratum that constructs our ego and our personality. So it says in expansion, it is that thought. So all of this, even our personality, is what our life experiences and our thoughts are. And finally, we see that in expansion, it is the thought. You see that the body can expand to a particular measurement, maybe 200 kilograms, or height 6 feet, 7 feet, and all those things. So the body can only grow to a particular dimension, and similarly, our height and so on. But you see that our thought is boundless. Our thought can expand like the universe. You see, and this the step 25 is really important. You probably would have heard this term called, think out of the box. And next time when somebody says think out of the box, you should tell them there is no box, right? We create an artificial box, we get into the box, and all our lives we try to get out of the box. And here, if you have this universal mindset, you realize that there is no box, there's nothing bounds you. You are that universal identity that you continuously can expand. So if the mind is able to understand its true nature, the mind becomes boundless. The intellect becomes boundless in its precision and understanding. So we see that here, Swamiji says in step 25, is that in expansion, it is thought. Thought is what gives us that ability to manifest beyond our material identity. He also then speaks about speed. Speed is also sound. It is sound because it's vibration. And if you see what speed is, the transmission of energy across time, and we see that this is what vibration is, you see, and how fast energy is transferred from one place or one molecule to the other is through that resonance of vibration. So in the form, it is fire. And if you see very clearly, I think maybe some of you all would have thought about what fire is, or heat. If you touch something that is very hot, what that means is that the molecules in your hand is in a different frequency than the hot plate that is very hot. So that vibration is much more intensive than the molecules on that surface is much more intensive than the molecules on your hand. So when you touch it, the molecules that are vibrating at a lower level in your hands will start resonating at a higher level, like the plate, which is very hot. And what happens is that when your hand palm molecule starts vibrating, you feel the heat transfer. And when the heat is very high, the molecules in your hand starts separating. And this is when you start getting burns and all the other things. So you see, he's explaining the physics of this universe using, understanding of what the spiritual, realm is. So what he is doing here is spiritualizing science and scientifying spirituality. So he sees that there is no separation between the two. So he speaks about how the form, in form, it is fire. So that means that, we are seeing that heat, that vibration of that molecules, that circular circling of the electrons over time. All these are vibrations that gives rise to photon, which is light and fire and all those things. So again, he says that, he explains this. All of that is happening in us. The heat our body generates, the neural connectivity, all these are part and parcel of that thought, that measure of experience. And then he goes on to explain that, the atoms coming together and separating, the sense of touch, sight, all those things that we experience are an experience. It's the thought. And all this emanates from one place. And that one place is the thinker within all of us. The thinker is called in many, many names, Knower, I, God, the God, consciousness, Bhagavan, Chaitanya, Paranjodi. We call it by different names. Whatever we call that names, that substratum is present in all of us. And if the mind is able to understand this substratum, the mind realizes that it is that. The mind is that. And when the mind recognizes that, the mind is able to then harness this powerful force that is inherent in itself, that unbounded, expansive, that is able to generate the most magnificent thought, the most universal thought. So though living in a limited body, the mind can be unlimited. Though the body is mortal, the mind becomes immortal. Though the body is perishable, the mind is imperishable. Though the body is finite, the mind becomes infinite. So, and one who practices this is called a Mahan, a universal personality. And we see that Swamiji walks through this journey step by step on defining what this is, defining this experience, shows a method to experience this and derive the impact, to our lives, to how to continuously refine, continuously, harness this force, ultimately attaining that self-realization process. So the thought is very important. Sandosham.